and Stephen Pearlbinder. Tonight, we are celebrating International Women's Day, which is coming up on March 8th. And we are focusing our conversation today on a wonderful book, which is called Women on Migration, Responses in Art and History. And this is the book. And this book is going to be available at the Parish Museum Shop. And here are the other good news. We are reopening the parish in a week on March 12th. So please make your reservation and come visit us, come back to the museum. So tonight, I am also very pleased to have 3 contributors with me of this book. And as the title says, the book is about experiences of women when they go through migration. And so I would like to introduce the 3 presenters that we have with us tonight. They're all wonderful writers, artists, and activists in their own right. And they also happen to be part of the faculty at NYU Tisch School of the Arts in the Department of Art and Public Policy. So first of all, I want to thank you, Kathy Engel, for bringing the book to my attention. This was over a year ago, actually, and this was actually the first program that we had to cancel because of the pandemic. And I'm so pleased that you came back to me and that we are able to do this program now tonight. Then I'm also welcoming Grace Anissa Ali, as well as Ellen Toscano. And Ellen is actually editor of the book, and she will give you a brief introduction about the book and the project, how this whole book came about in a second, and then we will hear from each presenter as they will read an excerpt from their essay, and then we'll have a conversation, and then you can also ask some questions in the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Ellen, please take it away.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for re-inviting us in a new format. And thank you to the Parish Art Museum for the opportunity to speak with your community. So the book arose out of a convening in June of 2017. Dr. Deborah Willis and I convened a group of 40 plus women in Florence. Initially, we wanted to bring people together to respond to the wave of migration from North Africa into Europe through Italy. Many people, unfortunately, perishing at sea. And we wanted to think about that humanitarian crisis in the context of other contemporary and historic movements of people. And I say crisis to refer not to the migration itself, but to the policy response, to the difficulty of Europe and Italy in responding to this wave of people. Initially, everybody was very sympathetic, sending boats out into the sea to bring people back. And as the years progressed, like in the United States, the narrative got more hostile and more toxic. So we brought together a group of visual artists, writers, filmmakers, scholars. We workshopped privately in a wonderful convening of 2 days. And the book resulted from that gathering. The theory of the case was basically that the public policy lens through which migration is generally analyzed or thought about is an essential lens, but it's certainly not the only one, and that the stories of women, both visual and literary, contemporary and historic, collective and individual, may tell a different story and may help to nuance a policy debate that was increasingly problematic. And our hope is that telling the stories of people, of what people endure in order to seek a better life, might help to change the political context. So yeah, we situate ourselves very firmly in the world of social justice advocacy, though I think most artists would reject the idea that their work was instrumentalized for politics per se. I don't think anyone objects to the characterization that we are all social justice warriors or advocates. I can answer more questions about the project later. I should say that after that initial convening, we met again in Abu Dhabi. We were about to meet in Athens when COVID struck. In each of the places we go, we invite scholars and artists from the regional area, which brings more and different stories to the table. So
that's wonderful, Ellen. And I know you have women from all over the world who contributed to the book.
Yes.
Right.
So
should we get started with some presentations from the essays from the book?
Yeah. I think I'm first up, no?
Yes, you are.
Let me share my screen as we have practiced. There we go. How are we doing? Is that visible and correct? There, I moved my cursor. Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm going to read not from my story, my essay, but a kind of adaptation for a short presentation. It was through the investigation of a rich socialite and an ambitious librarian that the previously unknown racial identity of a 6-year-old girl, my grandmother, came to light on a beach in Italy in the summer of 2010. I was not looking for complexity or coherence or even the excitement that this investigation ultimately brought to me, but through it, I came to understand the consequence of migration, the liberty of withholding, and concealment, and the powerful self-fashioning of transitive identities. 2010, August, the most unbearable summer month in Italy, when those who can head to the sea. I could leave my duties as the director of Villa La Pietra, which is not showing, not advancing. There we go. The House Museum in Florence, Italy, that containing 6,000 objects of art, furniture, tapestry, books, photographs on a 38-acre estate in Florence, now owned by New York University. The villa and the estate were previously owned by the Acton family. It was Hortense Mitchell, a wealthy socialite from Chicago. Was that?
Sorry, I think that was me, and I apologize.
Oh, not at all.
Issues. Okay. So yeah, please go ahead.
All right, it was Hortense Mitchell, a wealthy socialite from Chicago, who purchased the 15th century estate with the extraordinary fortune amassed by her father, one of the founders of the Illinois Trust and Savings Bank in Chicago. In 1903, Hortense married Arthur Acton, the rather less distinguished but socially ambitious adventurer. They settled in Florence and began a life of collecting art and entertaining. By July 1904, they started a family. Hortense never returned to live in Chicago. Pictures kept in the archive at Villa La Pietra reveal that Hortense had traveled extensively. Again, not advancing. Before she married, apparently seeking a life different from that which was expected of the young, rich debutantes of her day. If you can advance the images. No. I don't know why it's not advancing. Okay, there we go. We know nothing about Hortense's motivation for uprooting her comfortable existence and emigrating to Florence. What was she leaving when she quit Chicago? Aside from her wealth, was she extraordinary? Was it away from the ordinary that she was traveling? Myself, an expat, the rather more genteel word for immigrant, The question of why people chose to leave and disrupt their lives, leave behind a regular, knowable, and predictable life for an uncertain and precarious existence in an unknown place was increasingly on my mind. I was always asked to account for myself by the community into which I inserted myself and that which I left behind. My goal that August was to tackle the 580-page book entitled An Illuminated Life by Heidi Arditsone. I'd been drawn to the biography since the subject was an occasional companion of Bernard Berenson, the art historian living in Florence, more or less a contemporary of the Actons and an occasional visitor to Villa La Pietra. In 1905, Bell was a young librarian at Princeton University when banking tycoon J.P. Morgan hired her to help him to expand and organize his rare and medieval Renaissance book collection. Through her travels to Florence with Morgan, she met and entered into a long affair with Berenson. Arditsone's research into Bell is exhaustive, in part relying on the substantial collection of letters from Bell to Berenson, which Bell had expressly directed Berenson to destroy. Bell was exotic, unmarried, private, and beautiful, apparently alone in the world. The exoticism and mystery were said to be the product of her Portuguese background. Arditsone's biography, however, reveals that unbeknownst to Morgan, Berenson, and all of the social milieu, Bell was born Bell Marion Greener into a prominent Black family in Washington, D.C. She'd invented her name and the Portuguese heritage in order to pass into white society. Somewhere in the middle of this book, I stopped reading about Bell and Morgan and Berenson and the Actons. I started reading voraciously for clues. Somehow I realized that this story, this narrative of exoticism, intelligence, ambition, mystery, and hiding, illuminated some of the unacknowledged secrets of my family. With my daughter sleeping at my side and my exhaustion overcome by the adrenaline of the chase, I went online and accepted Ancestry.com's convenient introductory offer of 2 weeks of genealogical research for free. I began searching for my grandmother, Mary Godfrey. I'd been told that my grandmother had been brought in 1904 or 5 from Cuba by her parents when she was 6 or 7 years old to Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I knew nothing else. I knew nothing about family or siblings, nothing about the motives for leaving, nothing about this, nothing more than the sparse story of immigration. I began to search Mary Godfrey in Great Barrington, birth year 1900, plus or minus 5 years. One entry. I froze. Mary Godfrey, 1910, census, the 15-year-old, quote, Negro servant in the white household of the Noonan family in Great Barrington. I stared for a long time. I knew this was my grandmother. It was late, 3 o'clock in the morning, but I had to keep looking. My mother was still alive when I discovered this history, but I never confronted her with what I knew. Whatever she knew of her mother's life, I knew she didn't want me to know. And I didn't want to confront her with it at the end of her life. I couldn't help but to pick around the edges a bit, and once asked her how her mother had come to New York from Great Barrington. She answered, the church. What church? I asked, eager for any shred of information. St. Benedict's on the west side, she replied helpfully. The mission of St. Benedict the Moor was established in 1883 by a Catholic priest who had come to be deeply troubled by the conditions of the Black community in New York in the years following the Civil War. In his will, he left money to establish a parish for that community. Reverend John Burke became the first pastor. He built the church and founded a home for poor children located on McDougal Street and then in Rye, New York. And I've just lost my way. This is St. Benedict's home for destitute colored children. Excuse me. Okay, finding anything online from Italy beyond census documents proved impossible, though I spent many a night scrolling through records of Mary Godfrey's. One night, my eye fell on an entry from Mary Godfrey, a 7-year-old inmate in Rye, New York. Thinking inmate a strange description for a 7-year-old child, I clicked on the entry and found the document which would provide the connective tissue among the random collected documents and give me the first evidence of my grandmother's origins in South Carolina. An entry in the 1905 New York State Census listing the children living in St. Benedict's Home for Destitute Colored Children, the orphanage established by Father Burke. The following summer back in New York, I found the archive of St. Benedict's, and though I was denied access to the church, I was able, with a helpful contribution to the church, to get a church employee to send me a record of Mary Godfrey, an index card containing information of her arrival to the home and her departure 6 years later. In July 1904, the year that Hortense gave birth to the son who would lead La Pietra to New York University, a 6-year-old colored girl named Mary Godfrey was surrendered to St. Benedict's Home for Destitute Colored Children. The index card recording her admission listed her deceased, that's Father Godfrey, listed her deceased mother as Mary F. Washington and her, but failed to mention her father, noting only that he was alive and Protestant. According to the records of the church, Father Hopkins was pastor from 1894 to 1901 when he retired to ill health. That meant he was no longer an active priest at the time he took my grandmother north. On October 22nd, roughly a month after he delivered her to St. Benedict's, he died in Germany at a resort noted for its salt springs and healing waters. What did he have to do with my grandmother, and why did he bring her north? Mary stayed at her home until she was 12, when she was adopted by Mrs. Noonan in Great Barrington. The next records of Mary, also found within the records of the church, were her 1921 marriage certificate and the record of the baptism 2 years later of her daughter, my mother. My grandmother's trip north could be considered part of the Great Migration, the exodus of African Americans leaving the South to hoped for opportunity and freedom in the North in the early 20th century. The Warmth of Other Suns, a book by Isabel Wilkerson, tells the stories of 3 Black migrants, writing that what bound their stories and the stories of other migrants is, quote, the back against the wall, reluctant yet hopeful search for something better, any place but where they were. They did what human beings looking for freedom throughout history have often done. They left. Mary Godfrey didn't leave or go, she was brought. She was saved or gotten out of the way. Whatever motivated Father Hopkins, Christian love, guilt, money, parental duty, a deathbed act of kindness, hedging a life of luxury, he brought her north to an orphanage in which she would be educated, a right by no means certain in late 19th century South Carolina. She came north, barely aware of the South from which she was taken, taught the value of an education and tempted by the luxury of self-determination. What she learned or felt or reached for or struggled toward is unknown, except in the imprint she made on her daughter, a barely Black woman, also unaware of or undaunted by limitation, and light-skinned and audacious enough to walk out of her fate. I don't know that my grandmother ever acted to conceal her identity. It's more likely she lived her life exploiting whatever good fortune she encountered. Mary Godfrey was not Belle Greener. Migrating, leaning forward with hope and innocence does not always mean leaving something behind. Maybe you can make the past unimportant, if not invisible. I knew my mother had memories that would never be part of my life. I could hear her silences. Like Hortense, she never belonged or wanted to belong. She wanted to remain sufficiently outside to stay in possession of herself, always free to retreat into some carefully preserved, comfortable, and comforting secret self, always capable of annihilating any uncomfortable reality to make way for something more pleasant. She was powerful, willful, and creative, and deeply believed, as I believe Mary taught her, that one is the master of one's own identity, notwithstanding so much evidence to the contrary. That which is inconvenient or no longer relevant is expendable, and there's nothing sacred or even genuine about the truth. We moved frequently, migratory, never defining a home, never weighted by roots. If anyone chose to walk out of her history to embrace a life of creative insecurity, it was my mother. My migration is a kind of self-psychotherapy. I can never return to the place of my origin or answer all of my questions, but this does not concern me. Ultimately, like my mother and Hortense and Belle, my history is an act of creativity and imagination, an indulgence in not belonging, a migration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for this very personal story. And we'll get to some of the questions a bit later about what prompted you to write down that story and you know what that discovery did to you. So I think next up is Kathy, and you will be reading a poem and talk a bit about your contribution to the book.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ellen. I just want to keep listening, actually. I really want to also thank the parish again. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. For not only for this gathering today, and Corinne for responding, and Kara for steering me to Corinne, and Grace for saying, let's try it again a year later. But I want to just honor our community and cultural institutions and centers, because I don't think I'm being overly dramatic, although I could be, but I don't think I am, in saying that you, in some profound way, keep us alive. And this past year have even, have so vitally and bravely and tenaciously continued to support culture, art, imagination, and the possibility of gathering. So thank you for that. Thank you, Jen, Victor, and the whole staff. Of course, I thank my beloved artist, writer, scholar, activist sisters, Ellen Toscano and Grace Aniza Ali. I'm honored to be near you in this project. And thank you all for spending your Friday afternoon with us. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land where I am and where the parish is, and many of you are, and encourage those of you who are elsewhere to do the same and even enter it into the chat if you're so moved. I'm in Eastern Long Island, standing on, or sitting now on Shinnecock, Montaukett, Manhasset, Unkechaug, Korchog, and Setauket ancestral territory. The Shinnecock people, my neighbors, whose original territory lay between current-day Eastport to East Hampton, have endured the brutality of settler colonialism for over 375 years. Please join me in honoring the elders, past, present, and future, and the resilience of the Shinnecock people, leaders and protectors of community, history, traditions, lands, and waters. In thinking about migrations, my mind migrated in all kinds of directions. And I began thinking I would reflect on some of my work from more than now 40, 41, 42 years with women living within the multiple manifestations of war and occupation inside the US and across other borders. The geographies include Nicaragua, El Salvador, Haiti, South Africa, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Mississippi, Alabama, New York City, Long Island, and more. Women fleeing violence from inside and outside the home and the body through overt and covert domestic and foreign policies, unmitigated, systemic, intimate, structural trespass and violation, and the spectacular chosen travels of women daring to move into their strongest skins and voices, sometimes risking all. That's what I thought. But the story never really begins elsewhere, does it? So that's sort of the frame for the journey, the brief journey I take in my piece in this wonderful book. So what I'm going to do now, because my work has really always been some kind of weaving and traversing the most intimate with questions of the impact of policy or the people who are maybe geographically and culturally far from one another, but deeply connected. So I'm going to read a poem that is excerpted in my piece, in my submission, and appears fully in my book, which came out a year ago with Get Fresh Books. It's called The Lost Brother Alphabet, my newest book. Here it is. It's sort of fuzzy here. And before reading the poem, I just want to make note of a sister book called Borderlines, which is an incredible, and it's in the chat, I think there's a link, Poems of Migration. And it's an incredible anthology, which just came out a few months ago, and I'm honored to be in, edited by Michaela Maskaluk and Michael Waters. I encourage you to check it out. It feels very connected to what we're doing here. So this poem is called Coffee, and somehow I can't stop talking about or drinking or thinking about coffee. And in our conversation tonight, how the ways in which it also tells stories of migration and holds them. There's a reference to Grace, that is Grace Paley, the late writer, activist, teacher, and beloved extended family member. And there's a reference to Mahmoud Darwish, the amazing, at one time considered the national poet of Palestine, who was also a political leader. I think that's it for references. Coffee, hand-rubbed dark oil. I share my addiction with the loved dead. My coffee berry meets me in a favorite ample vessel, announcing where I've been or hope to go. Buffalo, Bolivia, Kenya. My father poured my first cup when I was 8, glint in his eye defying Mrs. Rankin's third grade teacher who insisted it would stunt my growth. He penned a caffeine verse his last years, sent me Bach's Coffee Cantata in duplicate. Balzac died of it, flood of bloodied mahogany, ink burst vein to page. I dream a coffee anthology, unfiltered, musky. Mahmoud Darwish measured his exactly each Beirut morning, 1982, bombs exploding, beloved steaming pot of thick black. In Grace's 11th Street kitchen, long-haired women mapped out sit-ins, peace, and PTA, pencils and newspapers piling up, old-fashioned New York coffee time. D from the island Grenada roasts his in the next town. B of Shinnecock Nation names her smoky brew Thunder Island. My father gulped his after toast with jam, and on the weekends, pancakes. Nuts he mashed in a mortar and corn flour, no electric pot for him. He ground a mean bean, boiled water in a kettle, early, old bathrobe and slippers, long talks at the table. Where did my coffee-loving father go? My grandmother, Henrietta, savored hers for hours, porcelain cup and saucer, large hands sifting and folding her famous buttery plum cake. Henry Street to 63rd, granules of her transplanted voice, like sugar or Yiddish, like loss. Java grounds and ash help Russian kale grow. Before morning compost spread, John brings the first cup to me early in bed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for the beautiful poem. And I would like to turn the word now to Grace.
Thank you, Kathy and Ellen. That was so beautiful, and a reminder of how we gathered both together in person in Florence, and then how 40 of us gathered on the page in this monumental collection. So I'm going to share my screen with everyone. You're looking at a page directly from the book, and I wrote sort of a two-part essay, a personal essay that leads into a curatorial essay. And I start out talking about my mother's migration story from Guyana to the United States, which is where we're from. And I rooted the story in this photograph of my mother at Guyana's airport. And she is the beautiful lady with long hair like mine in her floral pink dress right in the center. And so I'll read a short excerpt from the opening of the essay about her migration story in this photograph. And then I'll talk just briefly about the 4 artists of Guyanese heritage that were also beautifully doing work, engaging their own histories of migration from Guyana. There are 2 spectrums of the migration arc, the ones who leave and the ones who are left. The act of migration is an act of reciprocity. To leave a place, we recognize that we must leave others behind. Too often, though, those who are leaving eclipse the narratives of the ones who are left. I find myself often caught in this liminal space between those who leave and those who must remain, because for many years this was my story, and for many years before that, it was my mother's. In 1995, my family migrated from Guyana to the United States. We became part of what seemed like a mythical diaspora. Over 1 million Guyanese citizens now live in global cities like New York City, where we are the 5th largest immigrant group, to London and Toronto, while the country itself has a population of around just 760,000 people. In other words, my homeland is one where more people actually live outside its borders than within it. In 2015, Guyana celebrated its 50th anniversary of independence from the British. The last 5 decades, however, have been defined by an extraordinary exodus of its citizens. In fact, this small place has one of the world's highest out-migration rates. Making the journey with us when we left were a handful of photographs chronicling our life. Owning photographs was an act of privilege. They stood among our most valuable possessions. There were no negatives, no JPEGs, no double copies, just the originals. Decades later, these photographs serve as a tangible connection to a homeland left behind. Many of them, like the one you see here, are taken at Guyana's airport during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when we often bade farewell to yet another family member leaving. Movement and transition were the constants in our lives. Airports became sites for family reunions. And before I nervously boarded my first plane at 14 years old, a one-way flight bound for New York's JFK airport, I had long resented planes as the violent machines that fragmented families. Before my mother boarded that same flight at 39 years old with her 3 children in tow, She had in the years prior witnessed her brothers and sisters all leave Guyana one by one. By 19, a cycle of poverty and the final straw, the loss of both of her parents within a few short years of each other, ushered in a series of constant departures. Beginning in the 70s, her 6 siblings joined the mass exodus of Guyanese leaving Guyana. They first left for neighboring Caribbean islands and then later Canada and the United States through student visas, work visas, marriage visas, whatever it took. During the 3 decades that my mother spent waiting for our family's visas and papers to be vetted by 2 governments, Guyana and the United States, she watched the one she loved the most leave her country and leave her multiple times over. And so this idea of migration being this two-way street, the ones we leave and the ones that are left, carries over into the 4 artists who I talked about in the second part of the essay: Keisha Scarville, Christy Neptune, Erica de Freitas, and Khadija Ben. And they're all of Guyanese heritage by some shape or form. Either their mothers were born in Guyana, or their fathers, or they themselves were born in Guyana and migrated to the United States or Canada. But their work has really moved me in very deeply personal and intimate ways because of the thoughtful use of photography as a medium to tell Guyanese women's stories. And as you'll see, as I just quickly go through a few images, like the story I just told about my mother, their work speaks to who and what gets left, what survives, what is mourned, both the tangible and intangible things when we talk about migration. And this is Keisha Scarville, who is Brooklyn-based photographer. Her mother is Guyanese, and at the unfortunate passing of her mother, she packed all her mother's clothes in a suitcase and went to Guyana, to the places her mother grew up, the place her mother was born, and created this beautiful, beautiful series called Mama's Clothes, where she's dressed in these sculptural renditions of her mother's clothing. This is the work of Erica de Freitas, who is Guyanese Canadian. Her grandmother and mother grew up with this beautiful knowledge of making and icing cakes. And so Erica adapted it in her artistic practice and created this beautiful series of this, her mother on my left, and the artist on her right, where she appropriates that tradition of icing cakes. And it's a beautiful way to talk about the intangible things, the rituals and the memories and the traditions that we bring with us and pass on when we migrate. This is the work of Christy Neptune, who did a beautiful examination of the intersection of labor and loneliness and solitude for so many women that migrate, including Guyanese women. When we come to these new homelands and we take on these jobs that can be under the table, they're home care workers, they're hospital workers, but the solitude and the agony and the labor of these kinds of jobs that many immigrant women take on. And she's done a beautiful series called Memories from Yonder, looking at this beautiful woman, Eldora, and her experience of coming from Guyana to work as a home care aide in the United States. And lastly, this is the portraits of Khadija Ben, who's based in Guyana. And she's done this gorgeous series of portraits of our Amerindian elders who, despite the fact that their children, their grandchildren, at times even their great-grandchildren, are leaving and migrating to neighboring Venezuela, to the Caribbean, to the United States and Canada, these beautiful elder women who have spent their entire lives in Guyana choose to stay. And so it's a beautiful, and again, another poignant and important perspective to be on that arc of migration, to watch the people you love leave, and you are the one that is left. And then finally, I've expanded all of that. Our book together, Ellen, Kathy, and I, was such an inspiration that last fall we published a book bringing together all of these beautiful Guyanese women's stories and their photography and their art and their memoir and their poetry. And so the artists I just talked about are again featured more expansively in this collection, Liminal Spaces. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alisa and Grace, sorry, and thank you all of you for contributing from your essays in the book. And I feel they're all very, very touching. They're very personal in the way you talk about shifts, inner shifts, but also outer shifts, the movement, the tangible, the intangible that is connected with migration. And I just want to ask all of you, how do you think art can help to make sense of all of that, of these very profound and sometimes very troubling shifts that go on when, and as Grace, as you said it very beautifully, those who leave, but also those who are left behind, because there's always that connection, right, between those who leave, those who change, and those who stay home, and how do you connect with that? But I would like to start with Ellen, and you know, I mean, this is a very very moving story when you suddenly discover that your grandmother was someone that you think she wasn't, and you know, with especially in America, you know, with the history of race, must have been a very profound discovery for you. So how did you deal with that, and how did you transform that into art or into writing?
So, I mean, in a way, I feel like I always knew that story in some part of my consciousness. I always knew that that there was something more to my background than I knew. And strangely, or maybe not so strangely, I had trained. I'm a lawyer by training. I had trained in civil rights law. That's what I had done as a career. I was always very embedded in topics of racial justice in the United States. So the discovery was surprising and kind of glorious, but in some ways not surprising at all. And why
was it not surprising? I'm just curious.
I think that there was some way that some of this history was transmitted to me in other ways. And I'm writing, probably developing this into a book, and there's I explore some of that in the book, stories that were read to me as a child. In some ways, I also think maybe nobody was hiding anything, and it was my failure to be curious, kind of the complacency of my everyday life didn't lead me to ask questions about things that may have been more obvious than I thought. It's certainly a story that I love. I believe it's more a story about me and my mother than necessarily about my grandmother. And in fact, as I write, I have two documents. One is all of the research, which is traditional archival unsatisfactory research, because the documentation of the birth of a Black child in the late 1800s in South Carolina is sparse at best. But the second document is me watching me do this work, and recollections as they flow in, memories as they occur to me, things that become more salient now because I have this additional knowledge of my past. And I'm sort of writing it with those two documents in parallel.
Right. It's amazing how strikingly you look alike with your mother.
Yeah.
From that photograph.
Right.
And so she never talked about that, or she
no.
didn't.
And I honestly don't know what she knew.
Right.
It might be that she believed her mother came from Cuba at that point in time,
right?
Instead of from South Carolina. Although, there are other things that make me think maybe she knew more than she let on.
Right. There's other kinds of memories that
Right.
body and just consciousness. Yeah.
You know, that generation, I'm sure we all know this, you know, my mother would sort of like, why are you so curious about your past? They were all about assimilation and mainstreaming and not being different, right? So, you know, it didn't seem that uncharacteristic, her.
Right, right.
You know.
Thank you. I would like to ask Kathy, in your work as a organizer, and you've worked a lot with women, with migrant women. How has art helped you to make sense of the stories, which I'm sure some of them are very difficult, you know, with the hard realities of the lives of women who migrate, and you're a poet. So there's this two very sort of, you know, strong opposites of realities, and how do you bring that together in your work?
What a great question. Thank you. I think that I come to everything as a poet, even if I'm not writing a poem or writing a good poem. I think that's how I engage and enter and even hopefully listen. So my work has always been story-based, narrative-based, and it even started before I started doing this work. I think that was kind of a mode for me of sharing stories and listening for stories. And so I think that to go back to the question that you posed, I guess, for us all about what can art do, I think that art, however we define it, and for me, art and specifically poetry in its many manifestations, lives in the liminal spaces, lives in the in-between, and in the places that don't get looked at, or don't want to be looked at, or don't want to be talked about, or people don't want to talk about them. And that's the dare and the potential liberation and beauty and transformation, one of them in art. So I think that when we're talking about realities and truths that are really hard, and they often are, to just for people to tell them, for them to be heard, for them to then be written, often when possible, and sometimes they can't be, is a liberating process, and often a healing process. And the poetry, I think where the struggle is, or the separation, is really in the kind of question of how do you give space for those different parts of your being, and I think we all probably have that, whether you're teaching or parenting or sistering or organizing, you know, how do you give space in your body and your psyche for the quiet that is required, in, at least for me, in making a poem, or for a poem to emerge, and the engagement and publicness and externalizing that's required to do public work and community work. But to me, the actual work of it, or the joy of this kind of connection, the poetry isn't separate. It just has to find its place. Does that make sense? I don't know if it does.
Absolutely. And you know, when you talk about space, I think there's also something emotional with art. You know, art touches us on a different level, and I think that's maybe also what can be meant when you talk about space. It's just giving it a distance from, you know, the pure, you know, cognitive way of dealing with something. Yeah.
You know, the poet Muriel Rukeyser said once, what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. And I think that you know, that kind of speaks to the question and we know it. We know it's all around us. The meaning and power and the daring to tell what you don't want to tell. The conflict sometimes is if you're in a coalition or if you're you know, speaking on behalf of, you do have to be diplomatic at times. You have to temper what you're saying. You have to speak on behalf of, and that's the opposite of what you're doing in your art, at least for me. And those are interesting dissonances, right? To find out what's calling you and where you can be most powerful or most effective.
Right. Thank you. Grace, I was really struck when you said that more Guyanese live outside of Guyana than inside. So that means a lot of stories of this rupture, you know, a lot of stories of leaving, being left. And thank you for showing the images of these artists, these women artists, who seem to connect a lot with their mothers through their art, you know, the objects of their mothers. And I thought it was really beautiful the way you also talked about, you know, the photographs becoming objects, because nowadays photographs are so, you know, fleeting. And at the time, I mean, I remember when I came to this country, I used to write letters to my mother. That was the only object we had, you know, we had each other's letters or photographs, and it meant so much. So can you talk a little bit more about what it means for you, Grace, personally, you know, in terms of the art in dealing with the diaspora?
When we've been on a book tour, like I shared earlier, the Women in Migrations essay was such a beautiful inspiration and catalyst for just a book on Guyanese women and their migration stories. And so we've been on a book tour for that book last fall. And my favorite responses are women from China or Philippines or India or Ethiopia connecting with Guyanese stories, finding the through lines, maybe not so much the specific anecdotes or an object or a recipe, but I think the feelings and the sentiment and the ethos of the relationships that we talk about. And so I don't take that lightly at all. I think that's an incredible gift for, you know, women from all over the world to tap into our stories, our Guyanese women's stories, particularly because Guyana is such a place that is so under the radar and its stories are so undertold. So to see these global connections coming in is wonderful. And so the question of what can art do, or what does art do to our migration stories, I think it strips away the borders, you know, it strips away the divisions, or at least dispels them a little bit, so you can begin to see those connections and those ways of togetherness, how our stories are more together than they're apart even more. I do think that the impact on migration on all of our lives, you know, Ellen's essay, Kathy's poetry, as we've seen. I've been thinking a lot about this term. We've been hearing a lot about long haulers when we talk about COVID, and how, you know, we're now beginning to understand the effects that this thing will have on our bodies and our psyches and our spirits for a long time. I think that theory applies to the impact of migration. I think the way that it fractures and ruptures our lives is a long haul kind of experience. And sometimes it'll show up in very subtle ways, and sometimes it'll show up 10 years later in magnanimous ways. But that long haul kind of way of thinking about the impact of migration is something that I'm always trying to interrogate within my own life, within my writing, and within my scholarship.
Right, and it can show up in, you know, future generations, as we see with Ellen, you know, and I think others amongst us, right? I wanted to ask Ellen, when you started out with the book, you know, you, Deb, and Brooks, how did you choose the contributors? You have some, very well-known visual artists like Vangeshi Mutu, Karen Finley. You have scholars. You have a really wonderful range of women who write about their or other women's experiences. So how did you choose? How did you make that choice?
Well, again, initially we didn't choose contributors to a book, but to a conversation in Italy, and wanted a very diverse group of people from different disciplines, from different places in their careers. There were very well-established artists, and there were a lot of emerging artists. And, much of it is the network, the very beautiful network of Deb Willis. And people over the course of now maybe 15 of these convenings come to us in a beautiful way. And so I guess we look for balance in not viewpoint as much as where people are coming from and what they have to contribute from a disciplinary perspective. And the kind of through lines that go through the work that emerge when you see the book, that you think was all very conscious and curated, was less than conscious, right? And it comes from the mutual influence that we all have on each other's work and in each other's thinking.
What are some of these through lines that you're talking about?
Well, even those that we've heard here, the importance of where the equal importance of where you leave and what you carry with you, the importance of home and memory, the kind of privileging stories that have not been told before, and the stories, though they have many commonalities, have a lot of unique, individualized perspectives as well. So I think the through lines are the through lines of the experience that Grace was just speaking about, that there is a commonality of experience. And if we focus or can focus on that commonality, if we can hold that in our thinking, when we think more broadly about migration, perhaps we can have a better, more sympathetic view of the people we encounter themselves in very difficult circumstances where we all may have been, or our ancestors may have been at some point in our lives.
Absolutely. I definitely believe that we can all connect through stories. And what do you think distinguishes women's stories or women's experiences? And that's a question to all of you. I would like to open up the questions to the audience if there are questions, but that's sort of my last question that I have to all of you. What makes a woman's experience in migration different?
Well, in terms of the data, women migrate, and I think starting in 2016 globally, women are the ones migrating more now than men, and that is an incredible piece of information to think about. And so that
why is that? Do you know why that is? Because it used to be more usually men who go first, and then maybe the family follows, but maybe not. So yeah.
I think a big part of it is that more women are head of households now more than ever as well. They are the leaders in their households. They're the ones responsible for the family thriving, the family living. And so when they move, the family moves. And in order for a family to thrive, they have to move. And so I think because we see more women becoming solely in charge of the preservation and the thriving of their families, you see more women taking on that kind of agency and leaving a place for another.
I find that really interesting. Just as a reference, I read that there are about 70 million migrants all over the world right now. And I think these are the largest numbers in a long time.
Right.
So that's quite striking. Ellen or Kathy?
I think women also carry a different sense of responsibility for family and memory and history than men. I think they're probably less economic, and the data will show this, less strictly economic or political refugees. Sometimes the ambition to make a better life for your family is more overt in women. I mean, frankly, that's anecdotal, probably more than it is statistical. But I do think that the stories that we hear or see in the work of the women in this volume and in the one that's to come really reflect on the difficulty of grappling with issues of home and disconnecting from roots that are meaningful and strong, and kind of put the lie to the mythology of people just leaving exclusively to be in an economically better circumstance. I mean, people are leaving for a variety of painful reasons that I think somehow are more reflected in the experience of women, but probably not.
Right. Thank you, Kathy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, probably too many, but and also some, many anecdotal, but I think it's important also to keep the context and to keep in mind always the historical violences that women globally have and continue to endure. This is a reality. And along with the violence is the violence of silencing. And so why is it important for women to tell stories? It's important for the record and the acknowledgement of what all of the lives are and have been, and the work that it takes and the courage that it takes to break silence as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not unrelated to questions of migration and questions of who flees, who stays, what are the multiple what is the labor involved in being a woman?
Yeah.
So that's just a little part.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you. I'm looking if there are any questions, but there are not. So this is your chance to ask questions in the audience. But we got some very nice comments, and I just want to thank you all for your very thoughtful contributions to the book and to our conversation tonight. So thank you again, Kathy, for bringing this to me a year later, and I'm so glad we can do this despite of everything that's still going on. So thank you very much. And just a reminder, we are reopening on March 12th at the parish. Please come and visit us, and of course all of you are invited to come, and we shall continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Grace and Kathy, also.
Thank you so
Lovely
much.
to be with you again.
Yes.